The city buzzed with life as General Raymond Brooks made his way down the bustling street. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the sidewalks and shimmering off the glass of towering buildings. His military uniform, perfectly pressed and adorned with medals and insignias, stood out amongst the sea of casual passers-by. His gait was calm, steady, his presence one of quiet authority. He had just attended a formal military ceremony, and though the day had been long, he remained composed, a man accustomed to carrying the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. As he walked, a white police car rolled by, slowing to a crawl. Inside, Officer Derek Mullins, a broad-shouldered cop with a hard set to his jaw, peered through the window. Mullins had a reputation for being aggressive, especially toward people of color. His eyes narrowed as they locked onto Brooks, taking in the high-ranking general's presence. Mullins scowled. "What's this guy doing here?" he muttered to himself, feeling a rush of suspicion as he pulled the car over and stepped out. His boots hit the pavement with a thud, and with a quick adjustment of his belt, he began to stride toward Brooks. Brooks noticed the officer approaching, but maintained his calm demeanor, aware of the often complex interactions between black men and the police. His instinct told him something was off, but he continued walking at his usual pace, keeping his head high. "Hey!" Mullins' voice boomed from behind. "You there! Stop!" Brooks slowed to a halt and turned to face the officer. His eyes locked on Mullins, studying the man's aggressive stance. The general had faced much worse in combat zones, but there was something about the blatant hostility radiating from Mullins that felt unsettling. "Is there a problem, officer?" Brooks asked, his voice even and controlled. Mullins took a step closer, his hand resting on the holster of his gun as he scanned Brooks from head to toe. "What are you doing here?" Mullins took a step closer, his hand resting on the holster of his gun as he scanned Brooks from head to toe. "What are you doing here, huh?" Mullins's tone was sharp, dripping with suspicion. His gaze flicked over the medals on Brooks' chest, but rather than recognizing the man's status, he only saw what his biases allowed him to see: a black man standing in an affluent part of town. "I'm on my way home," Brooks replied calmly, trying to de-escalate what was clearly becoming a charged situation. "Is there something I can help you with?" Mullins snorted, clearly unimpressed. "Help me? You think you're some kind of big shot?" He stepped closer, looming over Brooks with a sense of authority that felt both unearned and dangerous. Brooks met Mullins' glare without flinching. "I'm General Raymond Brooks. I'm a high-ranking officer in the United States Army. There's no need for any trouble here." For a moment Mullins hesitated, his lips tightening into a thin line. He'd heard the name before, but the man standing before him didn't match the picture in his head. To him, a general was someone in a suit, someone with status and wealth, but certainly not a black man walking alone on the street. Mullins's prejudice clouded his judgment, feeding into his ego. "A general?" Mullins said, mocking laughter escaping his lips. "You expect me to believe that?" His eyes flickered with condescension as he took another step closer. "Listen, I don't care who you say you are. This is my beat, and around here you follow my rules. Now, hands where I can see them." Brooks, still maintaining his composure, could feel the tension escalating rapidly. He knew the type of officer he was dealing with. He'd seen it before. This wasn't about enforcing the law, this was about power and control. "I'm not looking for any trouble, officer. I assure you, I've done nothing wrong." Mullins wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. In his eyes, Brooks was just another man to intimidate, another individual to exert his authority over. "I said hands where I can see them. Or do you want to make this harder on yourself?" The street began to quiet around them, a few pedestrians slowing their pace to watch the scene unfold. Brooks could feel the weight of their stares, but he wasn't going to give Mullins the satisfaction of losing his composure. Slowly, he raised his hands, hoping that this would calm the situation. "Good," Mullins growled, moving in quickly. Without warning, he grabbed Brooks's arm roughly, twisting it behind his back. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists, biting into his skin. The injustice of it stung more than the cuffs themselves. "You're under arrest." "For what?" Brooks asked. his voice still steady despite the growing anger beneath the surface. Mullins leaned in close, his breath hot with arrogance. For resisting an officer and looking suspicious. And I'm sure I can find a few other things to add once we get to the station. Brooks's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He knew better than to engage further in this moment, though the humiliation burned deep. A decorated general being paraded like a common criminal, all because of the color of his skin. The crowd that had gathered was murmuring now, some with phones out, recording the scene. Among them, a woman in her mid-30s, clearly disturbed by what she was witnessing, called out, "Hey, that man didn't do anything. Why are you arresting him?" Mullins shot her a glare. "Mind your own business, lady, unless you want to join him." But the murmurs continued. People recognized Brooks now. His name had been in the papers recently after a successful military operation, and whispers of "That's General Brooks" spread like wildfire through the small crowd. As Mullins pushed Brooks toward his squad car, one of the onlookers finally shouted, "That's General Raymond Brooks! You're arresting a hero!" Mullins stiffened for a moment, the weight of the words hitting him. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Hero or not," he spat, shoving Brooks into the back seat, "he's not above the law." Back at the police station, the mood was tense. Brooks sat in a holding cell, his expression calm, but his thoughts racing. How had things escalated so quickly? He had spent his entire career defending the country, only to be treated like a criminal in his own city. Officer Mullins stood at the front desk, filling out paperwork with a smug grin on his face. He thought he had shown Brooks who was in charge. But what he didn't realize was that the video of the arrest had already gone viral, and it was spreading fast. At that moment, Captain Harris, the head of the precinct, walked into the room. A seasoned officer with years of experience, Harris had earned the respect of his peers for his fairness and commitment to justice. He glanced at Mullins' paperwork, then back at the officer. "What's going on here, Mullins?" Harris asked, his voice carrying a weight of authority. Mullins looked up, his arrogance still palpable. "Just bringing in a guy who resisted arrest. Had an attitude." Harris frowned. "Who is it?" Mullins smirked. "Some guy claiming to be General Brooks." Harris's eyes widened, and his face went pale. "What did you say?" "You heard me. General Raymond Brooks. But he's probably lying. Just another guy trying to pull rank." Captain Harris's face hardened as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Mullins blinked, confused by the sudden shift in Harris's demeanor. "What are you talking about? He resisted, so I arrested him." Harris slammed his hand down on the desk, startling everyone in the room. "You just arrested one of the most decorated generals in the United States Army. This man is a national hero." Mullins faltered, his confidence wavering for the first time. I didn't know. You didn't check? You didn't think for 1 second that maybe, just maybe, you were making a mistake?" Harris's voice was rising, the anger clear in his tone. Mullins swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling under the weight of his captain's fury. He didn't cooperate." Harris cut him off. "You're in deep trouble, Mullins. Get him out of that cell. Now." Meanwhile, outside the station, the crowd had grown. Reporters, protesters, and concerned citizens had gathered, demanding answers. The video of the arrest was being broadcast on every major news network, and the police department was under fire. As Mullins reluctantly walked to the holding cell, keys in hand, he felt the weight of his actions. But it was too late to take it all back. The damage was done, and General Raymond Brooks' quiet dignity as he sat in that cell only made the officer feel smaller. Brooks stood when the door opened, his eyes locking onto Mullins with an intensity that made the officer look away. "You'll regret this," Brooks said quietly, his voice calm, but filled with the weight of a promise. And Mullins knew he would. General Raymond Brooks stood tall as Officer Mullins unlocked the holding cell. The clang of the metal bars echoed through the precinct, but Brooks' steady gaze never wavered. His mind was already moving ahead, calculating the ramifications of this unjust arrest. It wasn't just about him. This was a symbol of something much larger. The broken system, the power imbalance, and the racial prejudice that had festered for far too long. Mullins, still shaken after the encounter with Captain Harris, avoided Brooks' eyes as he opened the door. The bravado that had fueled his actions earlier had drained away, replaced by the cold reality of his mistake. "You're free to go," Mullins muttered, stepping aside. Brooks stepped out, his posture composed, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken in that moment. As he walked out of the precinct, every officer in the room seemed to stop what they were doing, their eyes tracking his every move. Some recognized him now, others had heard the whispers. There was a ripple of tension that followed him all the way to the exit. But Brooks wasn't leaving this behind. Not by a long shot. Outside the police station, the atmosphere was electric. The crowd had swelled to hundreds, with news vans lining the streets and protesters demanding justice. Signs reading "Stop Racial Profiling" and "Justice for General Brooks" bobbed above the heads of the angry crowd. Camera crews jostled for position, eager to catch a glimpse of Brooks as he emerged. The moment Brooks stepped through the doors, the crowd erupted into cheers, a mix of support and outrage. Flashing lights from cameras lit up the evening, capturing his every movement. His lawyer, Arthur Davis, was already there waiting for him, a sharp, methodical man known for his relentless pursuit of justice in civil rights cases. "General," Davis greeted him with a firm handshake, though his expression remained grim. "We have a lot to discuss." Brooks nodded, still absorbing the scene in front of him. The media frenzy, the chanting, the public outcry. It was all overwhelming, but necessary. "Let's go somewhere quieter," Brooks replied, his voice low but filled with determination. "We have work to do." Back at Davis's office, Brooks sat down across from his lawyer, the weight of the past few hours finally beginning to settle in. Davis spread out a series of documents on the table: legal papers, news reports, and copies of the now viral video of Brooks' arrest. "This situation is already out of control," Davis said, tapping his finger on the stack of reports. "The media's all over it. We're going to need to be very strategic about how we handle this." Brooks glanced at the video footage playing on a nearby screen. The image of him being handcuffed by Mullins, the officer's smug grin, and the horrified onlookers, it all played out like a nightmare. But it wasn't just about him anymore. This was about exposing a system that had been failing people like him for too long. "We need to file a lawsuit," Brooks said firmly, looking Davis in the eye. "This can't go unpunished. Not just for me, but for every other black man who's been unjustly profiled and humiliated by the system." Davis nodded. "We'll be filing a civil rights lawsuit against the department and Officer Mullins personally. But we need more than just the video. We need witnesses, documentation of Mullins' past behavior, everything we can get to show that this was more than a one-time mistake." Brooks' expression hardened. "It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice." "What?" Davis leaned forward. "You're right. And we're going to make sure everyone sees that." Meanwhile, back at the police station, Officer Mullins sat nervously in Captain Harris's office. The captain's face was a mixture of anger and disbelief as he reviewed the situation. "You really stepped in it this time, Mullins," Harris said, his voice dangerously calm. He threw down the stack of papers in front of him. "Do you have any idea how much trouble this is causing?" Mullins shifted in his seat, sweat beading on his forehead. "I didn't know who he was, Captain. I thought—" "That's exactly the problem," Harris cut him off. "You didn't think. You saw a black man in a uniform and assumed he didn't belong. And now the entire department is under fire because of your stupidity." Mullins' face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "I was just doing my job." Harris stood up, towering over Mullins. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to humiliate and harass innocent citizens. Do you have any idea how much damage you've done? The mayor's been on the phone with me all day. The media's eating us alive. And General Brooks is one of the most respected men in the country. This isn't just going to go away, Mullins. There will be consequences." Mullins swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. What's going to happen to me?" Harris's eyes narrowed. "You're suspended, pending an internal investigation. I suggest you get a lawyer, because you're going to need one." Mullins felt the ground drop out from under him. "But "Get out of my office," Harris barked, pointing toward the door. As Mullins left, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a ton of bricks. His career, his reputation, it was all unraveling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Back at General Brooks' home, the weight of the day's events was beginning to settle in. Brooks sat at his kitchen table, staring at the papers spread out in front of him, his mind racing. He had been through war, seen the horrors of combat, but this was something different. This was a battle fought on home soil, against people who were supposed to be his protectors. His phone buzzed on the table and he glanced at the screen. It was Colonel Elena Smith, one of his closest friends and colleagues in the military. "Ray," she said, her voice warm but laced with concern. "I just saw the news. Are you all right?" Brooks sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm fine, Elena. Just trying to wrap my head around all of this." I can't believe this happened," Smith said, her voice filled with disbelief. "What are you going to do?" "I'm fighting it," Brooks replied firmly. "I'm filing a lawsuit. This can't go unchallenged." Smith was silent for a moment, and then she said, "You know I've got your back, right? Whatever you need. Witnesses, support, I'm here." Brooks smiled, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on him. "Thanks, Elena. I'm going to need all the help I can get." As he hung up the phone, Brooks leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be pushback, obstacles, and more than a few people who would try to silence him. But he wasn't backing down. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every black man and woman who had ever been mistreated, disrespected, and profiled because of the color of their skin. And he was going to make sure their voices were heard. General Brooks sat in his lawyer Arthur Davis's office, watching the viral video of his arrest play for what felt like the 100th time. The shaky footage, filmed by a concerned bystander, showed the moment Officer Mullins cuffed him. The arrogance in Mullins' posture contrasted sharply with Brooks' calm dignity. Brooks clenched his fists as he watched, though his face betrayed no emotion. He had learned, through years of military service, how to remain composed even under the harshest conditions. But this was different. Arthur Davis leaned forward, pausing the video on Mullins's smug face. "This is going to be key," Davis said, tapping the screen. "It shows exactly what we need: the racial bias, the unnecessary force, and the public outrage. The fact that it's gone viral is both a blessing and a curse. It's bringing attention to the issue, but it also means we have to be even more careful. One misstep, and they'll try to spin this against you." Brooks nodded, his mind already racing ahead. "I don't just want this to be about me, Arthur. I want this to be about the bigger picture. This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about the entire system that allows people like him to operate unchecked." Davis smiled grimly. "That's exactly the angle we're going to take. But we'll need more than just this video. We need witnesses. We need evidence of Mullins' past behavior. And we need to build a rock-solid case. And believe me, General, I plan on taking this as far as we can go." As if on cue, Davis's assistant knocked on the door and entered with a folder full of reports. "I've started digging into Officer Mullins' record," the assistant said, handing the file to Davis. "There's a history here. Several complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct, but none of them ever resulted in disciplinary action." "No." Brooks's eyes narrowed as Davis flipped through the documents. "This is what we need," Davis said. "This paints a picture of a cop who's been getting away with this for far too long." Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the tension was palpable. Captain Harris had called an emergency meeting with his top officers. The police department was in damage control mode, trying to contain the fallout from Mullins' arrest of General Brooks. The viral video had sparked protests outside the station, and the media was camped out, demanding answers. "We're in deep here, folks," Harris began, pacing the room with an intensity that made the other officers sit up straight. "This situation is getting worse by the hour. The mayor's on my back, the press is all over us, and the public outrage isn't dying down. We need to figure out how to handle this, and fast." One of the senior officers raised his hand. "What about Mullins? Are we throwing him under the bus?" Harris shot him a look. "We're conducting an internal investigation, and yes, if it turns out he acted inappropriately, which, let's be honest, he did, then yes, he'll be held accountable. We can't afford to protect him just because he's one of us. Not this time." The room fell silent. Everyone knew Mullins had been a loose cannon for years, but the department had always looked the other way. Now it was clear that was no longer an option. Mullins sat alone in his apartment, staring at the paperwork spread across his kitchen table. He had been suspended, pending the results of the internal investigation, but he knew his career was over. The video was damning, and he had no doubt that Brooks and his lawyer were going to come after him hard. He could feel the walls closing in around him. His phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at the screen. It was a text from one of his colleagues. "You messed up, man. It's all over the news." Oh! Mullins gritted his teeth, his mind racing. How had everything gone so wrong? He had always prided himself on being a tough cop, someone who didn't back down, but now it was all unraveling. And the worst part? He knew, deep down, that he had let his prejudice cloud his judgment. He had seen Brooks, a black man in a military uniform, and immediately assumed he didn't belong. Now that snap decision was going to cost him everything. He slammed his fist on the table, sending papers flying. "Damn it!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty apartment. He grabbed his phone and dialed his lawyer. "We need to talk." Back in Davis's office, Brooks and his legal team were finalizing their strategy. They had gathered witness statements from several bystanders who had seen the arrest, all of whom described Mullins' behavior as aggressive and unnecessary. One witness, a young woman named Lisa, had even captured additional footage on her phone, showing Mullins taunting Brooks after he had been handcuffed. "We'll use this," Davis said, reviewing the footage. "It shows Mullins for what he is, an officer abusing his power. And with his history of misconduct, this will be more than enough to build our case." Brooks leaned back in his chair, his mind still focused on the bigger picture. "What about the department?" he asked. "They're just as guilty as Mullins. They let him get away with this for years." "Oh!" Davis nodded. "We'll be filing a civil rights lawsuit against the department as well. This goes beyond just one officer. This is about systemic failure." The day of the press conference arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. Outside the courthouse, a massive crowd had gathered. Protesters holding signs demanding justice, news crews setting up their cameras, and onlookers waiting to see how this would all play out. Brooks and Davis stood at the podium, ready to address the public. Brooks took a deep breath before stepping up to the microphone. He had spent his life leading men into battle, but this, standing in front of cameras and speaking to the world, felt different. It felt personal. "Good afternoon," Brooks began, his voice steady and strong. "As many of you know, I was recently the victim of an unjust arrest by Officer Derek Mullins of the local police department. I was targeted not because of my actions, but because of the color of my skin. I was treated as a suspect in my own country, a country I've spent my entire career serving and defending." The crowd listened intently, the weight of Brooks' words sinking in. "But this isn't just about me," Brooks continued. "This is about a system that allows officers like Derek Mullins to operate without accountability. This is about the countless black men and women who have been harassed, profiled, and mistreated by the very people who are supposed to protect them. This is about change." Davis stepped forward, outlining the legal action they were taking against both Mullins and the police department. The press snapped photos, reporters jotted down notes, and the crowd erupted into cheers of support. Back at the precinct, the mood was grim. Captain Harris watched the press conference unfold on the television in his office, a sinking feeling settling in his gut. He knew this was just the beginning. The department was going to be under intense scrutiny, and heads were going to roll. And he couldn't protect Mullins anymore. Mullins sat in his lawyer's office, watching the same broadcast. His face was pale, his hands trembling as the reality of his situation hit him. This wasn't going to blow over. He wasn't going to get a slap on the wrist and be able to move on with his life. His career, his reputation, everything he had built was crumbling before his eyes. His lawyer, A sharp-tongued man named Frank Allen turned to him. "We're going to need a solid defense, Derek. This isn't just going to be about that arrest. They're coming for everything. The racial profiling, the excessive force complaints. You've got a lot of baggage, and they're going to use all of it." Mullins swallowed hard. What do we do?" Allen sighed, rubbing his temples. "We fight, but it's going to be an uphill battle." As the legal proceedings began, Brooks and Davis prepared for a long fight. The lawsuit had been filed, and now the focus shifted to building their case. They gathered more witnesses, reviewed more footage, and prepared to take on not just Mullins, but the entire police department. The public support for Brooks was overwhelming. People from all over the country rallied behind him, sharing their own stories of racial profiling and police misconduct. The case had become a national conversation, and Brooks had become a symbol of the fight for justice. But Brooks knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and there would be challenges at every turn. But he was ready. He had spent his life fighting for his country, and now he would fight for something even bigger: justice for all. General Brooks sat at the kitchen table of his modest suburban home, the sunlight casting soft shadows through the blinds. Despite the peace and quiet surrounding him, his mind was still a storm of thoughts. The lawsuit had been filed, the media had latched onto his story, and now the world was watching. But with all the attention came a burden, one he had carried since the moment Officer Mullins decided to arrest him simply for walking while black. As he sat, his phone buzzed again. Another news alert, another op-ed, another wave of public support. He appreciated it, but each notification was a reminder that his fight wasn't over. He opened the article on his phone, reading the headline: "General Raymond Brooks takes a stand against police brutality. Will this be the tipping point?" He sighed, placing the phone back on the table. Brooks knew his fight wasn't just his own anymore. It had taken on a life of its own, and now the entire country was looking to him as a symbol. It was a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but one he wouldn't shy away from. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Brooks opened the door to find Colonel Elena Smith, his longtime friend and colleague, standing there. She was dressed casually, but still carried the air of authority that came with her position in the military. "Elena," Brooks greeted her, smiling faintly. "Good to see you." Smith stepped inside, immediately sensing the weight on Brooks' shoulders. "I came as soon as I heard the latest," she said, her voice low. "How are you holding up?" Brooks motioned for her to sit, then followed her into the living room. "I'm holding up," he replied. "But it's hard, Elena. This is bigger than I ever expected. I knew it would be a fight, but now it feels like the whole country is watching." And they are," Smith said. "But that's not a bad thing, Ray. This is what needs to happen. People need to see the truth, how deep this problem runs. Your case isn't just about you anymore. It's about all of us." Brooks nodded, his eyes distant. "I know, but I can't help but wonder. How many more people have to suffer before something changes?" Smith leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. "As many as it takes. And I know you. If anyone can lead this fight, it's you." Meanwhile, at the police station, the mood had turned from tense to outright hostile. Officer Mullins, now suspended and awaiting his fate, had become the department's scapegoat. He sat in the dim, sterile office of his lawyer, Frank Allen, his leg bouncing nervously. "We're getting slaughtered in the press," Allen said, throwing down a stack of printed articles onto the desk. "The public's turned against you, Derek. And with your history, it's not looking good." Mullins ran a hand through his hair, the frustration and fear evident in his expression. "I didn't know who he was. I didn't mean for it to get this far. He stopped himself, knowing that his words sounded weak. Allen sighed heavily. "Look, Derek, you need to understand something. This case isn't about whether or not you knew who Brooks was. It's about your actions and what they represent. The public sees you as a symbol of everything wrong with the system, and they want blood. If we're going to stand a chance, we need to play this carefully. You'll need to own up to your actions, at least partially, and show some remorse." Mullins's eyes narrowed, his anger boiling beneath the surface. "So what? I just take the fall for this? What about the department? They knew about me. They let me get away with this for years. Alan raised an eyebrow. That's precisely the point. You were part of a system that allowed this behavior to thrive. But now, they're turning on you to save themselves. Mullins clenched his fists, the realization settling in. He was being hung out to dry, and there was no one left to protect him. So, what do we do now? He asked, his voice quieter, more defeated. We prepare for trial, Alan said, standing up and gathering his things. And we hope for the best. Back at Davis's office, General Brooks and Arthur Davis were reviewing the latest developments in the case. The lawsuit had drawn attention from civil rights organizations, activists, and even a few high-profile politicians. The pressure was mounting on the police department, and they were scrambling to contain the damage. Davis looked up from his notes. The department is starting to fold, he said. They've initiated their own internal review, and they're trying to distance themselves from Mullins. But we know better. This isn't just about one officer. This is about the whole system. Brooks nodded. That's exactly what we need to focus on. Mullins is just a symptom. The department has a history of ignoring complaints, covering up misconduct, and allowing officers like him to continue unchecked. We need to expose that. Davis smiled slightly. I've already started gathering testimony from past victims of racial profiling and excessive force by Mullins and other officers in the precinct. The pattern is clear, and it's damning. This isn't going to end well for them. Brooks leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the moment. Good, because I'm not letting this go. As the days passed, the protests outside the police station grew larger, more organized. Civil rights groups had joined forces, turning the movement into a nationwide rallying cry. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Brooks" and "End Police Brutality" were held high as crowds marched through the streets, demanding change. The pressure on the police department and city officials reached a boiling point. The mayor, under immense scrutiny, called for an independent investigation into the police department's handling of the Brooks case and its broader practices. The public demanded accountability, and now the city had no choice but to respond. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension as the trial began. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, and onlookers all eager to see how this case would play out. On one side sat General Brooks, flanked by Arthur Davis and his legal team. On the other sat Officer Mullins, looking pale and defeated, with Frank Allen by his side. The prosecution wasted no time, laying out the case against Mullins. They painted a picture of an officer who had abused his power, using racial bias as justification for his actions. They detailed Mullins's history, complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct, all of which had been swept under the rug by the department. The viral video of Brooks' arrest was played for the jury, the room falling silent as Mullins' actions were laid bare for everyone to see. The smug grin on his face, the unnecessary force, the humiliation. It was all there, captured in vivid detail. Brooks sat quietly, his face a mask of calm, though his mind was racing. This trial wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been mistreated by the system, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on him. As the trial continued, the defense attempted to paint Mullins as a good cop who had made a mistake. They argued that he had acted in the heat of the moment, that he hadn't known who Brooks was, and that his actions were not racially motivated. But the prosecution was relentless. They called witnesses, bystanders who had seen the arrest, former victims of Mullins' misconduct, and even fellow officers who testified about the culture within the department. It became clear that Mullins was not just a rogue cop, he was a product of a broken system. Davis delivered a powerful closing argument, standing before the jury with a calm but forceful presence. This case isn't just about one man, he began. It's about the system that allowed him to operate with impunity. Officer Mullins didn't just make a mistake. He made a choice fueled by bias, by prejudice, and by the belief that he could get away with it. And he was right. For years, he got away with it. But not anymore. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courtroom growing with each passing minute. Finally, they returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. Officer Mullins was found guilty of misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse of power. The police department, too, faced consequences. The city was ordered to conduct sweeping reforms within the department, addressing the systemic issues that had allowed officers like Mullins to operate unchecked. For Brooks, it was a victory, but a bittersweet one. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over, not until real, lasting change took hold. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers as the news spread. Protesters hugged, journalists rushed to file their reports, and activists vowed to keep the momentum going. Brooks stepped out into the sunlight, greeted by a wave of applause from the gathered crowd. He glanced at Davis, who gave him a small nod of approval. As Brooks stood there, taking it all in, he knew that this moment, this victory, wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever been wronged, everyone who had ever been silenced, and everyone who had ever fought for justice. And as he walked away from the courthouse, the weight on his shoulders felt just a little bit lighter. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation as Officer Derek Mullins was led back to his seat after hearing the guilty verdict. General Raymond Brooks sat calmly beside Arthur Davis, his lawyer. Brooks's expression was unreadable, but deep down, a weight he had carried for months began to lift. The fight had been long and hard, but now justice had finally been served, or at least a step toward justice. Mullins, on the other hand, looked like a man facing the edge of a cliff. His career, his reputation, everything he had built was crumbling beneath him. He slumped in his chair, eyes darting around the courtroom, searching for something, anything that might save him from the inevitable. The judge, a stern-looking woman with silver hair and piercing eyes, called the room to order. "The jury has reached a verdict," she said, her voice carrying a weight of finality. "Officer Derek Mullins, you have been found guilty of misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse of power. The court will now hear sentencing recommendations." Arthur Davis rose to his feet, moving to the center of the room. He adjusted his tie before turning to address the court. His voice was steady, deliberate. "Your Honor, while the guilty verdict is a significant step toward justice, it's important to remember the broader implications of this case. Officer Mullins' actions were not isolated. They are a reflection of a much larger issue within the police department and, frankly, within our society. We ask that the court impose a sentence that not only holds him accountable, but sends a message that this kind of behavior will no longer be tolerated." The room was silent as Davis spoke. Even Mullins' lawyer, Frank Allen, didn't bother to interrupt. The truth had already been laid bare, and there was no more denying it. When it was Allen's turn to speak, he did so reluctantly. He was no longer defending Mullins' actions, but instead pleading for leniency. "Your Honor," Allen began, his voice strained, "while my client acknowledges his mistakes, we ask the court to consider his years of service. Officer Mullins has spent his career in law enforcement, and while his actions in this case were regrettable, they do not define the entirety of his service." The judge listened intently but remained impassive. When both sides finished, she called for a brief recess to consider the sentencing. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was charged with energy. Protesters and supporters had gathered in massive numbers, their voices filling the air with chants of "Justice for Brooks" and "End police brutality." The case had captured national attention, and the verdict only fueled the ongoing movement for police reform and accountability. Journalists stood ready with microphones in hand, waiting for the court to resume and deliver the final sentence. This case had become a symbol for the fight against systemic racism and police misconduct, and everyone knew that the outcome of the sentencing would reverberate far beyond this single courtroom. Back inside, Brooks sat quietly, his thoughts far from the courtroom. Though he was relieved by the guilty verdict, the deeper scars left by the ordeal were still raw. He had spent years defending his country, putting his life on the line for a nation that, in a moment, had treated him as nothing more than a threat based on the color of his skin. This wasn't just about one incident with Officer Mullins, it was about an entire system that allowed this to happen. Arthur Davis glanced over at Brooks. "You okay?" Brooks nodded slowly. "I'm fine, but I know this is only the beginning. There's still so much work to be done." Davis smiled faintly. "You're right, but this is a start, and it's a big one." When the judge returned to the courtroom, the room fell silent. The moment everyone had been waiting for was finally here. Judge Watkins shuffled her papers before looking directly at Mullins. Her gaze was hard, unflinching. "Officer Derek Mullins, this court has found you guilty of multiple charges, including racial profiling, abuse of power, and misconduct. These actions not only violated the rights of General Brooks, but also damaged public trust in law enforcement. The court recognizes that your actions are reflective of broader issues within the department, but that does not absolve you of responsibility." She paused, her words hanging heavy in the air. "Therefore, it is the decision of this court to sentence you to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 2 years. In addition, you will be required to complete community service and undergo sensitivity training as part of your rehabilitation." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of relief and disappointment. For some, the sentence was not harsh enough given the gravity of Mullins' actions. But for others, it represented a step in the right direction. A rare instance where a police officer was actually held accountable for abusing his power. Brooks sat still, absorbing the sentence. He had hoped for more, something that would truly shake the system. But he knew this was only one battle in a much larger war. As the court adjourned, the media rushed to capture the reactions of both sides. Mullins was led away in handcuffs, his face pale and expressionless. There was no bravado left in him, no trace of the smug officer who had unjustly arrested Brooks just months before. Arthur Davis gathered his files and turned to Brooks. "It's over, Ray. For now." Brooks stood, his posture as straight as ever. "For now," he repeated quietly. "But we're not done." Outside the courthouse, Brooks was met with a wall of reporters and protesters. The cameras flashed as microphones were thrust in his face. People shouted his name, asking for his reaction, his thoughts on the sentence, and what came next. Brooks took a deep breath before speaking. "Today, justice was served, but this is just the beginning. What happened to me happens to black men and women across this country every day. The system is broken, and it's going to take all of us to fix it. I am grateful for the support I've received, but my fight doesn't end here. I will continue to push for change, for accountability, and for a future where no one has to fear being treated as less than because of the color of their skin." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Brooks remained somber. He wasn't celebrating, not yet. There was still so much more to be done. Later that evening, Brooks returned to the quiet of his home. The adrenaline from the courtroom and the protests had worn off, and now he was left alone with his thoughts. He stood in his living room, looking out the window at the darkening sky. His phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Colonel Elena Smith. "Proud of you, Ray. This is the first step. Keep fighting." Brooks smiled softly at the message, appreciating the support. But even as he read it, he couldn't shake the feeling that this victory, while important, was just one step on a much longer journey. In the days that followed, the media continued to dissect the case. News outlets ran stories about the trial, about the systemic issues within the police department, and about the growing calls for reform. Activists used the momentum from the case to push for legislative changes, demanding that police departments across the country adopt new protocols for handling complaints, racial bias, and misconduct. Meanwhile, the police department where Mullins had worked faced its own reckoning. The internal review revealed a pattern of neglect and corruption, with officers like Mullins being allowed to operate unchecked for years. Several high-ranking officials were forced to resign, and the department began implementing reforms to restore public trust. But for Brooks, the fight wasn't just about the police. It was about a deeper cultural shift, one that would take years, maybe even decades, to fully achieve. And while the road ahead was long, Brooks was ready for it. He had spent his life serving his country, and now he would dedicate himself to serving his community in a different way. By continuing to fight for justice, equality, and the dismantling of the systems that allowed people like Mullins to thrive. And though the battle wasn't over, Brooks knew one thing for certain. The tide was finally starting to turn. And as long as there was work to be done, Benjamin Johnson was ready to do it.